Good morning, Journey. What is your picture of God? You think about this guy? Our culture has a lot of interesting ways to think about and engage with God, and many of them go sideways really quickly. There's a growing kind of current element of Viking culture in our media today. There's a lot of Viking shows on Netflix or on Amazon Prime, and some of them are worth watching, some of them you need to stay away from. But this Norse mythology is deep in this stuff. And the way that they think and talk about God is so foreign to us. It is really similar to what we see in Scripture with some of the pagan nations. They didn't worship God. They had a set of gods that they functioned and dealt with. And so much of it was built around like superstition and trying to appease these gods and win their will and win their favor and manipulating the world and moving into some crazy things, even human sacrifice in order to get their blessing. You see gods like Odin, the greatest of all, the first of their gods, who is also known as the All-Father, right? You see gods like, well, Frigg is his wife, gods like Freya. She was the goddess of love, lust, and fertility. Gods like Baldur, god of sun and God of wisdom. The god of Forseti, he was actually the god of justice and reconciliation. Probably the most common one, the one that will jump off of the page for you because of Marvel Comics, would be the god of Thor. You know this guy, right? So Marvel doesn't completely line up with their mythology, but this is the strongest of all the gods, right? You don't want to deal with his hammer. Hebrew Scriptures paints a very different picture of God. Instead of these collection of gods who we have to appease and manipulate to win their favor, it actually paints a picture that's completely the opposite. A picture of a God, the one and only God, the great I am, Yahweh, who is his entire movement into the world is to extend his favor. It speaks of this story, our story of the real true God who speaks and creation erupts. And as it begins, every piece of creation is built on top of the next with intentional design. And the apex of creation being his image bearers. Being humanity made in his image with his spark, with his creative ability and his ruling control over the exact creation that he's moved into. And it tells a story of this loving God who made us for relationship, but whose creation rebels and relationship of love was broken. with each other and with him. And all of the rest of the story, from that moment to the end of the story and through now, everything else that Yahweh, the great I am, our God has done, can be defined in this phrase, and it's a phrase we've used a lot. A radical God, recklessly pursuing a rebellious people. It's not people trying to appease a God. It is a God trying to bring peace and fulfillment and reconciliation back home. It's a very different story. One of the capstone texts of this is how God describes himself, and it's a text that we've used several times over the last couple of months, reminding us of his nature. When God shows up and describes who he is to Moses, as Moses is beginning to lead the people, he says this. He says of himself, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And as we've said before, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished, because that is not a loving response, because it does not provide for reconciliation. See, our Yahweh, our God, is different. We're wrapping up this series called Acting Like Jesus. And as we consider what it is that Jesus is calling us to and what he's doing in our lives and how we are now to represent and follow him, we need to ask this question. If we're to act like Jesus, how does Jesus connect to that picture of that God? So today, that's the question that we're going to look at. We're going to look at how Jesus reflects the nature of God and what that now means for us. This whole series, we've been coming out of the Gospels and we've been looking at Jesus and how he functions with people. Today, we're going to do this a little different. We're going to come out of one of the most beautiful texts about who Jesus is and his nature. And as we do, I want to ask God's blessing over the reading of this text. I want to ask you to invite the Spirit of God to shape you here. So, Father, bless your word and open our hearts. Help us to see your Son. Colossians 1, starting in verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This text begins by describing Jesus as the image of God. It's an important idea. It's an important phrase, and it is so much more than just a picture representation. Like we could pull out any of our money. We could pull out our coins or our bills, and you see a picture representation of somebody important. And that has always kind of been the case with our money. Jesus is more than just a stamp, a symbol of God. Jesus is truly him. This whole image idea in Israel, it was very intended for them to not have these kinds of fake images of God, because God could not be contained in a representation. We talked about Norse mythology. Take a look at this. This was how they functioned with their gods. They would build statues and put them in a temple. They would carve out these little handheld idols, and they would hold them and pray to them. And God was in that thing. And our God turns to his people and he says, nothing that you create can touch who I am. So when he says that Jesus is the image of him, what he is saying is he's the exact representation of him. There is no separation. He's not a model for God. That's actually the language that the Hebrew writer uses in Hebrews chapter 1. He says the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of God himself. Jesus, in his own words, in John chapter 14, says, when they ask Jesus, they're like, well, Jesus, just show us the Father and that'll be enough. And he's like, don't you know? Haven't you seen? Don't you know that the Father is in me and I am in him? That you've seen the Father because you see me. This text continues. He says that Jesus is the firstborn. This is language of like birthright. In Jewish culture, the firstborn was the one who inherited all of the good stuff, right? He's the privileged heir of the throne. What he's saying here is that Jesus is over all of creation. He is the one who is got the greatest status. There's nothing higher. He is the supreme one of the entire world, and all things are subject to him. He is declaring, as Jesus saying, he is the firstborn of God, that he is Lord. There is no other. The text continues. It says, for in him all things were created. That story that we started with, when God speaks and creation erupts, that was Jesus. What this text is saying is that everything that God has ever said or done, Jesus is in it. Jesus isn't this afterthought of God. Jesus is God himself. And every word ever written in Scripture, every action ever done in our Hebrew text to the New Testament and into now, everything that God is and does, Jesus is there. And I'm not going to get into the Trinitarian doctrine and try to explain all of that. I just know that it is. We take a picture of who God is in the Hebrew texts. It is no different than the grace-filled God that we see of Jesus. They are one. It says, all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth. And this is kind of where we go when we think of this, right? We think of heaven and earth in physical realms. And what this language is, as you keep reading, you begin to realize that that's not what he's talking about at all. He's not talking about this space thing and this round globe thing. He's talking about two very different realities that function at once. This physical reality and the spiritual reality. That there is something going on in the spiritual realm, in the midst of our physical realm, that it may be unseen, but it is just as real in our Jesus is Lord of it all. Everything seen and everything unseen. He is over it and in control of it. Not only that, this text says that all of it exists for him. His entire movement into the world, it will all ultimately be for his glory. Both this physical world and the spiritual world will one day acknowledge that he is truly the one. The text continues. It says in verse 17 and 18 that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Here's this picture. Is that Jesus was not only there when in doing it, when God speaks, when Jesus speaks, you can even say that, and creation begins. But that Jesus is currently engaged in the creating process. That he is not a God who has created, spun the world, and stepped back and forgotten creation. That he is actively participating in every moment of every day. That creation is actually dependent on him showing up for today to exist. There's a book called Orthodoxy, written by G.K. Chesterton. And he says it this way. He says, it is possible that God says every morning, do it again, to the sun. And every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all the daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never gotten tired of making them. It may be that he has an eternal appetite of infancy. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. It's like painting this picture of God, of Jesus, that he is intimately, consistently present. Not apathetically watching how we function from afar. That he is intimately involved in the details of not only our creation, but of every moment of every day of your life. He's deeply invested, deeply engaged, and working for creation's good. And remember, you and I are his crowning achievement of creation. There's nothing he is working for more than for your good. He continues. He says in verse 17 and 18 that Jesus is the head of the body, the church. Like he is Lord, not only of the cosmos, he is Lord here. He is engaged and he is the authority. We said back in January, God's got this. God's got us. His shoulders are bigger than ours. Thank God for that, right? Imagine the church without Jesus being the head. Imagine Journey without Jesus being present. If you've ever been on a farm, you ever cooked a chicken for dinner? You ever put it on that chopping block and lop off that head and watch what happens to the body for a few seconds? That's what we would be like. Thank God he's in control. He continues in verse 17 and 18 that he's the beginning. It says, I don't love this language because I think they messed it up just a little, but he says, he is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. That and isn't actually in the text. It's used to help us put these two ideas together. What it really actually is intending to say is he is the beginning. That is, which means he is the beginning, which means he is the firstborn from among the dead. Here's what he's saying. Jesus is beginning something brand new. He is the one that has started it. And what has he started? He has started a new humanity. He has started a resurrected kind of life. He has initiated a resurrected people right now that will inherit it fully in the future. He is the first one among those. He is handing us the life that he intended. In verse 19 and 20, he doubles down on this fullness idea, this image of God idea. He says that he is the fullness of God. The language here that there is nothing that God is that Jesus is not. He is not second tier. He is God. And he is here. Jesus himself puts it this way: I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Verse 20. He says, through him to reconcile all things to himself. Now this is the deal. This is the good news that you'll want to hear. This is everything that Jesus is and everything that he's about. Jesus comes as the image of God, as the fullness of God, to do the work of God. God's number one passion and purpose in the world is to bring his kids home, to bring them back into relationship with him as he intended. There's nothing that Jesus wants more. There's nothing else that he is really about than righting all of that. And here's the good news about it. Through the power of the cross, ultimately, everything will be righted. Everything that's gone sideways will one day be fixed, because he has become victorious over all of it. Journey, what that means for us is that everything that we struggle with now will one day be taken care of. This will not continue. Reconciliation, being brought back home, is a work of God. Reconciliation is a beautiful thing, and it is the story of God, and it always comes like this. We know it in our relationships with each other. And in fact, we ought to model reconciliation out of how God does it with us. Reconciliation is required because there's been a relationship that has been broken. Reconciliation demands for it to exist that things are not right. The relationships are separated. It always involves two parties. And the beautiful thing about reconciliation is, in order for it to exist, there is an extension of grace. That one of those parties has got to step forward and try to move to fix what has gone wrong, or reconciliation will never occur. And that is our story of God. That is the person and presence of Jesus. It's what God has always been doing to bring that into reality. And Jesus himself is that gift of grace. It is through the extension of Jesus, God himself stepping in and making the way for us to come home. Because we would never on our own. Reconciliation also demands that as that gift has been extended, in order for reconciliation to occur, the gift has got to be received. Maybe the better word is accepted. that would become reconciled kind of people back in relationship. People who will move toward each other. And now as we apply it to God, people who will now move toward God and move back into a relationship and not walk away. Okay. So there's your theology from Colossians chapter 1. Here's the question. Why are we talking about this when we're talking about acting like Jesus? Right? I thought our theme was acting like Jesus. I thought our idea was to become people who are transformed into his image. We're not that. So what is this? Right? When we talk about thinking and acting like Jesus, we need to first truly have a grasp of who he is, what he's about, and what he is constantly doing in our midst and in our world. And this text, this beautiful picture of what Jesus is and does, finishes it for us. And it does our homework in asking this question of what does it mean for us for our own transformation in view of him. Listen to how he finishes. Colossians 1, verse 21. He says, in view of all this, right? You were once alienated from God, right? Reconciliation, there's a problem. That's who we used to be. We used to have a problem with him. You were once alienated from God, but now, well, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself. You were enemies. It's our language, people, right? Think and act like Jesus. Look at it. You were enemies in your, y'all are really excited about that one. You were enemies in your minds. Because of your evil behavior. The way we think, the way we act was foreign to him. It was causing separation from him. It is rebellion to the throne of God. But because Jesus is entered, because Jesus is present, because the God of reconciliation is working in us, we are now different kind of people. Look at it. But now, he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through his death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free of accusation. Journey by the work of the cross. By the power of God, the Creator, moving in with us, he recreates us to be a very different kind of people. Very literally a new creation, a new humanity, a people who are being reshaped and redefined by the one who speaks it into existence. It is not our good work that makes us begin to think better. It is the work of God who is constantly engaged in every moment of every day, entering into us, entering into our church, and taking over our minds. And inviting us to live in his way, no longer ours. There's an if clause that's coming, though. Take a look. Verse 23 and 24. All of this will occur if you continue in your faith. established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel. You see, when we become reconciled kind of people, we do that through our move into our faith and our trust that Jesus is who he says he is. That he is the Lord of all creation. That he is God. That the work of his blood on the cross is enough. But that he is Lord of our lives. Because he is Lord of all creation, we in our faith move and declare to a place to allow him to make him now Lord of our lives. We willingly give up ourselves and submit to him in his control. This language of if you continue in your faith, I'm not going to give you an English or a Greek lesson, but it is a present, continuing action. Our movement toward lordship with Jesus and our faith with him is not a one-time prayer. It's not a one-time decision. It is a constant life of submitting to him as Lord and letting him now rule and control every moment of every day as he intends to, as he is intimately involved in every moment and every day of his creation. It is us letting go and letting him take over that for us. And working it out. And constantly growing his way. And realizing when we don't think quite like him, realizing that we need to invite him to be Lord over that again. That when we don't act quite like him, inviting him to be Lord over that again. It is a relationship of submission and lordship that completely allows him to transform us into his image. So here's your take home. If you have a phone, take a picture. How does this help us with acting like Jesus? Continue in your faith. Make a decision today to make him Lord of today. And journey, if you've never made him Lord yet, make him Lord today. And then we now live out of his greatest desire. We now invite him to have his way. It's the way of reconciliation. We intend, as we make him Lord, to hand over our lives and to live in a reconciled way with him every moment of every day. We invite him to take over with the way that we think and now the way that we act. And as we do that, we get to begin to extend that into our world. And one of the most powerful ways that we can do that, please hear me here. This is not just about you and God. As we become transformed and reconciled kind of people, we extend transformation and reconciliation into our world, and we take the nature, the presence, the power, the authority of Jesus into our world and into our relationships, and we become a people who hand off reconciliation, both to other people with God, but absolutely to other people with us. We have got to become a people who invite the kind of reconciliation with other people, offering them grace where it was not deserved, the way that God has with us. And we will truly begin to be people who are transformed into his image and who actually do in real time think and act like